we did a second one that got 562 responses. The majority of responses were from UK, Japan, and Mexico participants, although we had more than 50 countries who were involved. Okay, so when I began to analyze these data, I was interested to know about how people will cope with the well-being. So I went specifically into questions about coping and also questions about hopes for the future. You know, how would it be? You know, what do they think of what their life would look like after the pandemic? So because I was living in Japan, I kind of started to gather data and responses from the Japanese participants. But because I also lived in the UK before, and there was quite a substantial answers from the UK participants, out of curiosity, I did a comparison. So what I found was that generally the UK participants mentioned activities like yoga, meditation, mindfulness, running, cycling, walking the dog, talking to friends and family online, and generally they also emphasize more exercising. Japanese participants, on the other hand, tend to focus more on following media news closely, following government rules, keeping a routine, and understanding their role in society. They also mentioned the importance of family activities like cooking for the family. A lot of participants mentioned that one of the things they appreciated in the pandemic was that they were cooking nice meals for their family. Now, findings like these really fascinate me because every individual faces the same issue, and threats to their health and well-being, but the way they respond to it, it's differently. And people often don't think of how someone perceives living well as a cultural artifact. But in anthropology, we like to focus on how something comes about and the resources of meaning. So given that participants had these different ideas about well-being, then I started to think of, well, then how living a good life comes about to Japanese people during the pandemic crisis. And where would I begin? Well, in questioning how living a good life comes about to Japanese people, I engage with this concept called Ikigai. So what is Ikigai? Well, loosely, Ikigai is a Japanese cultural term that is referred as having purpose in life or a reason for living, a process of realization or gaining joy from doing something. And there are many studies that have been done already on Ikigai, and lately there's actually a boom on self-help books on Ikigai, finding Ikigai, understanding Ikigai. You also, if you do a quick Google search, there's lots of podcasts and blogs and so on about Ikigai. But what I would like to focus today, what I would like to focus today is actually just 3 quick definitions of Ikigai or concepts of Ikigai from anthropologists, psychologists, and neuroscientists. So the first one that I present you is from Mieko Kamiya, which is a Japanese psychiatrist, and she was the first Japanese woman to conduct qualitative analysis on Ikigai. She wrote a famous book, Ikigai ni Tsuite, which is not translated into English. Unfortunately, we only have the Japanese version. And she was a psychiatrist, and she did some work with leprosy patients and in terminal illness conditions. And she wanted to investigate with these patients, so what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? When she tried to theorize Ikigai, she looked into Ikigai as perceptions and sources. So Ikigai perception, according to Mieko, occurs after satisfying certain needs, such as avoiding stagnation, seeking a bright future, building and maintaining interpersonal relationships, and self-cultivation. Now, the Ikigai source evoked Ikigai perception, and they were usually related Ikigai sources such as hobbies, people, life events, social roles, etc. So in a nutshell, for Kamiya, Ikigai is both a state of mind and something that is felt and valued. In anthropology, Gordon Matthews is a really interesting cross-comparison research. So he studied Ikigai and he did interviews with American citizens and Japanese. And with the first ones, with the American population, he never mentioned the word Ikigai, but he always led the questions that would bring about the Ikigai. Whereas with the Japanese participants, he used the word Ikigai directly. So Matthew Gordon describes Ikigai also in a very interesting way. He speaks about Jiko-Jituten, which refers to a sense of self-actualization and the development of self. And he also speaks in terms of Itaikan, refers to a sense of oneness, belonging to a group, and one role within that group. So again, like Kamiya speaks about sources and perception, Gordon speaks about this dual meaning, right? So it's about fulfillment, self-development, the role of the person, and alignment with the expectations of society. Lastly, there is this really interesting Japanese neuroscientist called Ken Mogi. And Ken Mogi also has been well known in the West because he created this very simple book called Ikigai. And he created the 5 pillars of Ikigai. So he talks about starting small, releasing yourself, harmony and sustainability, the joy of little things, and the being here and now. Now, what he says is that it's possible to find Ikigai in little things, and he states the most important thing is that you cannot and should not blame the environment for the lack of Ikigai. After all, it's up to you to find your own Ikigai in your own way. Now, this idea really struck me because how do we find well-being in doing little things in times of crisis? So how is it possible to find harmony or joy of being here and now when you're in lockdown? So because of Ikigai is a complex idea, and I wasn't assuming that I was going to find Ikigai on the survey data. What I'm proposing here is that Ikigai is one underlying cultural basis to explain the Japanese textual data, particularly in differences from other data, such as the UK data or Mexican data, for example. So what did I do as a pilot project? Well, I couldn't interview 2,500 people. So I went on and did my own interviews. So I interviewed my colleagues, my neighbors, friends, people that were interested to just talk to me about Ikigai. Then I read a lot of literature review. I applied a theoretical ground, which is Ikigai 9. I will speak about it in a moment, and validation by data. So when I spoke to my participants, first, what I came to realize is that Japanese people don't speak or think about Ikigai. It's more pragmatic. And in many words, Ikigai can be many things. So I got answers such as writing is my Ikigai. My cat is my Ikigai. My children are my Ikigai. But I also had people that said to me, well, flowers are my Ikigai, or to get knowledge or to make justice. So a local from Okinawa, and Okinawa is an island with lots of plants and trees and nature. She said she developed a love for plants, and she's been in the island all her life. So others said to me that it was about not bringing other people's moods down to the stress of the pandemic. So I see these balancing acts are personal, family, and social related. So I had a grasp of what people would consider the Ikigai is, and now I needed to understand the literature. So when I started to look at the literature, what I came across was, first, there's a lot of quantitative studies on Ikigai, not so much qualitative studies on Ikigai. Secondly, there's obviously much more studies conducted in Japanese than in English, but there are already a lot of studies conducted in English. Third, I also noticed that they were kind of population focused, either elderly people, either people with chronic conditions, illness. So I came to understand that there was a gap on qualitative studies and almost like the phenomenology of what is Ikigai, which I will talk about later. So I had 3 interviews, and then I had to kind of come across with some tool that would help me to analyze this data. So IKIGAI 9 is a psychometric tool which was published and validated by 3 Japanese researchers, and it was later translated and validated in a UK sample by DPhil, Yasushiro Kotera, and Kinishasan. So they test this IKIGAI 9 in a cross-cultural study with UK participants, and they wanted to explore some manifestations of Ikigai and other associated factors like well-being. And they explain that Ikigai 9 consists of 9 items measuring one's reasons for being through dimensions of emotions towards one's life, one's future, and the acknowledgement of one's existence. So in a nutshell, those were like the 9 measures, that the 9 statements. I believe that I have some impact on someone. My life is mentally rich and fulfilled. I'm interested in many things. I feel that I'm contributing to someone or society. I would like to develop myself. I often feel that I'm happy. I think my existence is needed by something or someone. I would like to learn something new or start something. And finally, I have room in my mind. So when I read these statements, and obviously they're quite broad, I could recognize some of the answers in the UK, in the survey participants. So what I decided to do was, because they're all interrelated, I just combined them into 3 main themes. And I applied to the survey data. So this is all very explanatory. And the first one, I call it self and other. And it brings about the 3 statements that says, I have impact on someone. I feel that I'm contributing to someone in society. I think that my experience is needed by someone or something. And here are some quotations that can allude to this idea. I'm just going to give you like a couple of time to read if you like. And they were obviously translated from Japanese into English. So these quotations, for me, suggest that for some participants, Ikigai is about caring for others, helping and serving the community, which is the sort of values that people needed, especially during pandemic times. And for example, I choose the medical doctors because we do know that during the pandemic times, the medical team was quite affected. Now, in our team, Matthew Broom, Clara Abstand, Rosa, and myself, we wrote on the phenomenology of the experience of molar injury and its relation to concepts of burnout, compassion fatigue, and we draw from our UK data, especially on narratives of morality, life both and outside of work. And we just submitted the article and we'll see where it takes us. So after the Japanese data, no one mentioned the word Ikigai, but we know that this concept relates to a sense of fulfilling social roles. And in the case of Japanese participants who are the medical doctors, for example, I would assume that Ikigai might be doing their job well. The second idea is the idea of self-development. Again, they are all interrelated. And I took these 3 statements. I'm interested in many things. I would like to develop myself, and I would like to learn something new. And here are some quotations. And for me, these quotations go back to the anthropologist Gordon Matthews' idea of Ikigai as a sense of self-actualization and self-development. So quotations like witnessing nature, or the chance to think and see things from a different perspective, or even reawakening a new hobby, like the lady in Okinawa that told me all of a sudden she developed love for plants. This kind of reflects a change in perception of people's being in the world during the pandemic times. So to a certain extent, it answers my questions that Japanese participants appreciate what Ken Mogisei is doing the little things during the pandemic times. And interesting for me, the last quote, the 0985, is from a participant. Oh, I think I'm giving you this one, sorry. The last one, the 0985, it's from a participant with chronic pulmonary condition. And I selected this answer because, to my view, it shows that people continue to construct meaning in their everyday lives, despite illness and other crises. And when I think about this idea, I think about one of our collaborations, Avi Karel's notion of living ill but well, and her phenomenology of illness. And she proposes that it's possible to achieve wellness while facing a illness and the crisis that arises from this experience. But I will talk about that later. So let me see if I don't get this wrong this time. Here we go, in the States. So this is the last one. In the States, again, they are so interrelated to the other one. So it's quite difficult, to separate them. But in a nutshell, in the States, mine relates to the last three statements of the Ikigai 9. I often feel that I'm happy. My life is mentally rich and fulfilled, and I have room in my mind. So now I go back to the right quotes. So in these quotes, I go back to Mieko Kamiya's reflection that Ikigai can be perceived as a reflection of one's life and value, which in my view, it's like a balancing act between an embodied sense of self, cultural and social values oriented to the world. So the quotations are interesting. One says about living with a dignifying life with no regrets. Another one says that it's striving for balance between not too pessimistic and not too optimistic. And these are sort of the answers that the Japanese participants gave actually in relation to hopes for the future. At the moment, Professor Avi Karel, myself, and another PhD student, Catherine, are also writing another article based on the survey data. And we are presenting a conceptualization of a pandemic body. We are in the process of writing, but we came up with 5 interesting themes. And we are combining anthropology from Mary Douglas that speaks about purity and risk and danger, what is pure and what is not pure, and Avi Karel's framework on phenomenology of illness. And these 5 themes are fear and danger, bodily doubt and hypervigilance, risk and trust, adapting and enduring, and changing perspective. So we suggest that pandemic has forced us to rethink the relationship with our bodies and with other bodies. And from this idea of thinking about other bodies and my body in embodying the pandemic, I started to think more about the role of the body in times of crisis. So this is an exploratory study. But by exploring the data this way, what I've learned is that the way we express well-being relates to social and cultural contexts. So I got interested more about cultural ideas of Ikigai and how this concept could help Japanese and non-Japanese researchers across the fields to examine cultural bases of well-being, meaning in life, not just in the pandemic, but also in times of crisis. So this is where the pandemic survey stopped. And this is just, now I'm going to present you a little bit of what I propose to do with my JSPS fellowship. So my study is called Embodied Ikigai, Japanese Women Narratives on Well-Being in Times of Crisis. What is this study about? If we could see it. I don't know why we can't see it. Here we go. This study explores Japanese women cultural ideas of well-being in relation to overcome crisis. And I say example as pandemic because pandemic is just one crisis. What defines crisis? There's so many ways of defining crisis. So I'm not just interested about their narratives during the pandemic times, but if they come up with other sort of personal crises, natural disasters, whatever they call crisis, I'm interested in to understand how they find Ikigai during times of crisis and what is the role of their bodies in maintaining their Ikigai. So focusing on Ikigai as a bodily felt experience, I want to clarify how women perceive this Ikigai concept as a cultural idea or motif in their lived experience. Now, in terms of the pandemic, I'll just give you a quick background. When I was writing my application and building this project, I understood that although the pandemic brought a lot of gender inequality, social justice, and so on, there are studies that already said that some Japanese women have reported, and I'm sorry for the translation, it says reported eating less as translated, but I would assume a healthier diet. So my mistake there. Also, they talk about increasing feelings of happiness. And there are other studies that's been conducted during the pandemic with women that says they practice temple meditation, yoga to build resilience, thrive during these emotional times and maintaining well-being. But there have been very little studies on Ikigai with the role of the body in times of crisis. So I want to fill that gap. And this is just an attempted Ikigai framework, okay? So let me go through it. In one hand, I want to develop an embodied paradigm for study Ikigai. And how do I want to do that? I want to use psychology studies, Mieko Kamiya, in anthropology, Gordon Matthews, and I also want to use Mishi Fukumano, who did qualitative studies on Japanese women and Ikigai. So I depart from the idea that Gordon Matthews says, if we are to conceptualize Ikigai, then this is finally a dispute over the Japanese self and how it should be defined. So if we have to investigate the Japanese self and its relation to culture to find out about the Ikigai experience. Therefore, I want to do two things. I want to go into Japanese philosophy and use the concept of Shogo Tanaka and his idea of Japanese self. And he says that the Japanese self is not collectivist and it's not individualist. It's between the body and the environment, meaning that the self is necessary ecological and finds his identity through the interaction with the environment. So Tanaka is quite critical about the westernized idea that the Japanese self is either collective or always dependent on the other. Then I look into cultural phenomenology and the work of Thomas Shordas. And he approaches the body in a similar way. He says that the body is an object to be studied in relation to, not in relation to culture, but a subject of culture. That is the essential ground of culture. And he talks about the self as a process of being. So which goes really well with Tanaka, that also says that the self is in between, and he actually uses another concept, a Japanese concept, aida, which is the concept in between. So in a nutshell, to study the embodied experience of Ikigai is to pay attention to the self as a continuous process of perceiving and performing Ikigai. If the Japanese self is then neither individual or collective, but interactional in its very nature, then embodied Ikigai is always experienced concerning the self and the nature, perception and practice grounded in culture. So in a nutshell, this is my model for studying embodied Ikigai. Because I will be doing interviews with Japanese women, qualitative studies, then I will look into, okay, gender now, focusing on gender, embodied Ikigai, but in the particular